Now, it's the Monitor's Mic with your host, Stella Cement.
Welcome to the Monitor's Mic, where we talk oversight, policing, and you. I'm Stella Cement, your host and the Independent Police Monitor for the City of New Orleans. And with me is Chriselle Williams, our Deputy Police Monitor. This show is your go-to source for discussing policing, law enforcement oversight, and how it impacts you. We're here to inform and empower you by unraveling the complexities of policing, updating you on the consent decree, and engaging in conversations that matter on policing, oversight, and the community. From the Office of the Independent Police Monitor, we offer an independent perspective on city government. The Office of the Independent Police Monitor, OIPM, serves as a crucial civilian oversight body for the New Orleans Police Department, NOPD. We ensure transparency and accountability within the police department by making sure that NOPD follows their policies, abides by the consent decree, and is compliant with all local, state, and federal laws. Our office operates independently from the NOPD and the federal monitors, allowing us to provide an impartial perspective on policing practices and investigations. But what do we do day to day? We take complaints of officer misconduct from the public and from police officers. We review misconduct investigations conducted by the NOPD's Internal Affairs, which is called the Public Integrity Bureau. We're on call 24 hours a day, every day of the year, for officer-involved shootings and critical incidents. We will go to the scene and monitor the force investigation from start to finish. We're advisory members of the Use of Force Review Board and the disciplinary hearings. We run the Community Police Mediation Program. We engage the community to ensure your voice, opinions, and concerns are heard. We, your hosts, are not police officers, but experienced lawyers from the criminal justice field, dedicated to transparency and accountability. We encourage you to call in with your questions, comments, and concerns. While we may not be able to address individual cases, we are committed to following up with you. So with that, let's learn more about today's guest. Chriselle?
John Alden has over 15 years of deep experience in law enforcement accountability. He currently serves as the director of the Independent Office Law Enforcement Review and Outreach, IOLERO, in Sonoma County, California. There he oversees the Sonoma County Sheriff's Office as an Inspector General, including oversight of both its patrol and jail functions. He also serves as a director on the board of NACO, the National Association for the Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement. Mr. Alden was the executive director of the Community Police Review Agency, CPRA, in the city of Oakland for nearly 3 years. There, he oversaw investigations of police misconduct and engaged the community in police reform efforts led by the Oakland Police Commission. Mr. Alden previously worked for the San Francisco Department of Police Accountability, formerly known as the Office of Citizen Complaints, and also for the Internal Affairs Division of the San Francisco Police Department. In those offices, he managed the investigation of complaints of excessive force, litigated disciplinary hearings, and advocated for changes in police policies and procedures. Mr. Alden also served as the managing attorney of the Independent Investigations Bureau in the San Francisco District Attorney's Office, a unit specializing in the investigation and prosecution of officer-involved shootings, in-custody deaths, and other forms of potential criminal officer misconduct. Before working in police accountability, Mr. Alden began his career as a prosecutor, working in Sonoma and Marin counties, and then transitioned to private practice litigating employment law matters. In his early career, he worked in the California State Legislature as an Unruh Fellow. Mr. Alden received both his law degree and bachelor's degree from the University of California, Berkeley. Thank you for joining us today, Mr. Alden. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on.
We're very excited to have you on. And for our listeners who made it through that bio, I just want to highlight that John has some really interesting experience. And I know people that are listening are probably thinking, this is California. Why should I care? And as a fellow Californian, I'm going to say, You should care, not just because we're talking about my home state, but because John actually was the police monitor for someone that New Orleanians are very familiar with, and that is Chief Kirkpatrick. So a lot of the experiences that he had in this region actually might end up being applicable to you and me in New Orleans. So with that, John, what is your position?
Right now, I'm the director of ILARO. That's the Independent Office of Law Enforcement Review and Outreach. And it's a monitor or inspector general over the Sheriff's Department in Sonoma County, California.
Great. And how did you get into oversight work?
Boy, that's a great question. I think some of it started from an experience I had really early in life. I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio. And I ended up working for a short time while I was still in school for an attorney there that did a lot of police misconduct cases. And in that time in particular, the gay community in Cincinnati was the subject of a lot of police brutality. And we had several cases from that community that were pretty gory. And I think it made me really sensitive to the issue of potential police misconduct. And then later in my career, I worked as a prosecutor. And I enjoyed the work in that there were a lot of opportunities to shift the focus of prosecution in those days more towards taking domestic violence more seriously, taking environmental crime more seriously. And as I worked in that field, I really actually enjoyed working with a lot of the police officers that I was with. And it helped me understand that I really appreciate and value a good cop. And it really deeply bothers me when there are bad cops out there. And some of that work led me to working for the San Francisco Police Department in the Internal Affairs Division. A friend of mine that had been a prosecutor with me convinced me to come do that job, and I just loved it because it was a great opportunity to both support the good cops and also identify the bad cops. And it taught me, too, that policy and training are really essential in policing, and got me really into doing that work, too.
That's really great to hear. And I just want to highlight the importance of this support the good cop, identify and address the bad cop mentality, because that exists in every field and it's so vital in policing. And there's a saying in business, the fastest way to lose a good employee is to fail to discipline a bad one. And when we're talking about officer retention and when we're talking about officer recruitment, quite frequently accountability and internal affairs divisions are pointed to as a reason why we're losing officers or failing to recruit officers. But in fact, I don't think we spend enough time talking about how those measures are what help us appreciate the good cops.
I think that's a great point. It reminds me that when I was working in the Internal Affairs Division of the San Francisco Police Department, I was often training sergeants who had been transferred there from other assignments or just been promoted to sergeant, and helping them learn how to investigate other police officers. And so usually their attitude on day one was, oh my God, how did I get this terrible assignment? What did I do wrong to be put in this job? And then 6 months later, they would start saying, well, some of the complaints I'm finding, don't have any basis, but sometimes the conduct I'm seeing here really bothers me. And then usually by the time they got to year 2, they'd say, there's a small number of people in this department that really need to not be here, and it really bothers me that I have to keep working with these people. We should be more effective at getting them out. It was really interesting to see that transition. And those people I found usually became better managers at the police department later in their career.
That's very interesting to hear about. So how is your police chief selected in Sonoma?
Well, we have a sheriff, so he's elected. And usually that happens every 4 years. We're in a weird cycle right now where our current sheriff had the benefit of state law changing a little bit, so it's going to be 5 years before he's reelected again. But that creates an interesting dynamic. When I've done accountability, police accountability in other places, it's usually been with a police chief who's hired by a mayor or a city council, and therefore is an employee of the same city that I'm working for. But here, I'm doing oversight over someone who's a separately elected official and does not report to the same bosses that I do, and ultimately only gets held accountable by the voters in the county.
Wow, that is a completely different dynamic.
It is. It's more complicated. It requires more persuasion. And it also means that some of the powers we have to look into how the sheriff's office is run are not as robust as they are in a city environment. So at least in California, sheriffs are given a lot of latitude, and our state law has given them a great deal of independence from all the other actors at the county level, or as you'd say here, the parish level. And so that definitely makes it harder sometimes to access information.
So, is there a civilian oversight board?
We do have a community advisory council. They don't weigh in on specific disciplinary cases like you see in some communities, but they do provide advice and feedback to the sheriff's office about policies and strategies. So if there's an enforcement priority that the community is bringing forward, the community advisory council might bring that to the sheriff, to the sheriff's attention. And when there's a policy that is maybe not landing well with the public, as was the case with our canine policy in the last couple of years, they can bring that advice forward to the sheriff and suggest changes in policy.
Okay, so it sounds like it's more of like an advisory recommendation-based model.
That's right. You know, these citizen advisory councils or police commissions or police review boards all have very different powers in different communities, and in part because state law gives so much power to sheriffs in California. The most that our community advisory council can do is try to create more connection with the community and provide some advice and direction. Even that, though, I found has been really helpful in Sonoma County.
How often do they take their advice?
Well, in our current sheriff's administration, they take the advice a lot, quite a bit. You know, we made a series of recommendations about how the use of police dogs could be improved over the last couple of years, and they took the majority of that advice. Not all of it, but most of it. And I've seen some significant improvement in the way that the canine unit works. I mean, we've seen the number of bites go down, the number of civil judgments against the county go down, and I think that's a real solid gain. But sometimes, we make recommendations that they take a pass on. And at least in the current administration, they tell us why. I think that's a positive, too.
Oh, that's a big positive.
Mm-hmm.
That's a big positive to understand the why.
Yeah, I think so, too. Historically, there were some other sheriffs before I came on in Sonoma County who wouldn't respond at all. And I think that actually was detrimental to everybody in the system because then the public felt not heard. And some in the sheriff's office felt maybe assailed or critiqued unfairly, but didn't have a way to give voice to that feeling. And shutting down the conversation that way actually makes everyone retreat to their corners and become defensive. So the fact that we have that conversation in Sonoma County, I think, is a positive, even if we don't agree.
I completely agree. And so frequently, whenever we're talking to municipalities, parishes, whatever, and I shouldn't say parishes because there's not too many of those outside of Louisiana. Counties. Whenever we talk to them and they have civilian oversight boards, they frequently say that one of the obstacles to civilian oversight boards being able to provide recommendations or have their recommendations taken are sometimes the police associations or unions, not necessarily the leadership of the department. So is that a factor in Sonoma? Are there police unions?
Yeah, absolutely. California allows police and sheriff's deputies to unionize. Technically, in California, we call them associations. But those groups are very well organized in California generally and have some really substantial power in state law to force the employer, so in this case the county of Sonoma or in a municipal police department, the city, to come to the table and negotiate with them over things like how will the disciplinary system work? Or if a policy or training is going to change, how will it change? And they're entitled to spend a fair bit of time with the employer negotiating over those changes before they become effective.
And is that negotiation otherwise known as collective bargaining?
Yeah, it's a form of collective bargaining. In California, we have a subset of that called meeting and conferring, which might come at any time. It doesn't have to be part of a contract necessarily. And we have a list that's quite long and detailed of what kinds of changes in the workplace trigger the meet and confer obligation. It applies to all public employees in California, teachers, firefighters, people who are maybe working in the medical profession for a city or a county. All are entitled to do this, but police have been especially assertive about using this power.
So, in places like, say, Chicago, we're frequently compared to Chicago's civilian oversight and to Chicago's models. And one factor in Chicago, though they have a lot of civilian oversight bodies there, and they have a lot of local ordinances and laws to be able to support oversight, is that they have collective bargaining abilities in Chicago. And the collective bargaining effectively means that through these negotiations, through the unions, the employers and the employees are having these conversations about what the terms of their employment is going to be. And that can include the benefits, pay, policies, as you highlighted, discipline, and how those things will be implemented. And in Chicago, that negotiation, those collective bargainings, can trump the local ordinances that are being enacted. So effectively, no matter what is being passed in Chicago, there is a way to kind of get around it if you're part of that police department. Is that a factor in Sonoma?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the conversations we're having right now in Sonoma County is how a voter-approved initiative from 2020 affects a lot of the ways that my office and our CAC work. Our belief at the county is that voter-approved initiative cannot be changed through collective bargaining or a meet and confer process. And it has become pretty clear that some of the deputy sheriff's unions, there are several in Sonoma County, really feel the opposite, that collective bargaining process can trump the voter-approved initiative. And in fact, we have some litigation going right now in an appellate court in the state of California about that issue, and it'll probably settle that issue, at least for now, in the state of California. So one thing that's exciting about our work is we're at least getting these really core issues of state law and about how employers and employees, work together in public employment settled.
When you say appellate court, out of curiosity, is it the Ninth Circuit?
No, it's not the federal Ninth Circuit. It's the state First Appellate District.
Okay. Just trying to gauge how much this might end up eventually influencing places like Louisiana and Texas, where they have meet and confer.
Yeah, it could. My understanding is that not all states have addressed this issue, and I think in California, from my perspective, the consensus among most lawyers is that a voter-approved initiative like the one we have probably cannot be trumped by a meet and confer agreement. But I understand that there are some attorneys in California, I think it's the other way around, and perhaps our state law could be clearer about that. So hopefully we get that clarity shortly.
Well, that's very exciting. Please keep us updated as that legal process continues.
Well, John, let's get to the powers of ILRO specifically. Do you all have investigatory power?
Yes, but only in a small number of cases.
What do you mean by that?
We can directly investigate the conduct of people in the sheriff's office where that conduct or failure to act led to a death, like an in-custody death in the jail, or a deputy-involved shooting that resulted in someone dying, or a vehicle pursuit that resulted in someone dying. We also have the ability to directly investigate cases where a whistleblower inside the sheriff's office or elsewhere in county government brought to our office a concern about something happening inside the sheriff's office. There is an opportunity for us to also directly investigate any case that the Internal Affairs Division investigated, but that we thought was not investigated completely. And so far we haven't done much of that, only because by the time we get to that finding that we think IA did an incomplete job, it's so late in the process that we haven't found it useful to do that yet. And we're focusing instead on the other direct investigations I just mentioned, which tend to be of higher community concern as well.
Does the police department have to adopt your investigation, your finding?
No.
So it is a recommendation, not so much a binding outcome?
That's right. So in the cases we investigate, there may be an investigation also by the Internal Affairs Division inside the sheriff's office. And if our opinions are different, in many of the cases I just described, that becomes publicly available. Most of the investigative work of Internal Affairs Divisions in California is considered a private personnel record of the people who were being investigated and therefore aren't available to the public. But in the cases of the deaths I just described, most of the time state law mandates that those investigations become public. So then the public will at least know what we thought and what the sheriff's office investigators thought, and then they'll be able to hear about the sheriff's ultimate decision and make a judgment about whether they think that was appropriate or not.
And can your office receive complaints of misconduct?
Yes, if someone complains to us, if it's not one of the cases that we directly investigate that I mentioned earlier, which is most of the time, then we give that complaint over to the sheriff's office. They investigate it. Sometimes people will ask to report anonymously, and we'll keep their identity anonymous if they want to. And when the sheriff's office is done investigating that case, they're required to send it back to us for review, and we double check the work. And that way the person who made the complaint will know both what the sheriff's office did with the complaint and also our evaluation of that work, and whether we agreed or disagreed with the sheriff's office, whether we thought their work was complete or timely. And I think that helps create a better sense of procedural justice for people in the community who want to make a complaint.
So when you say that you keep identities, like you will not release information about an individual's identity if they want to be anonymous, does that mean you have the ability to keep confidential information?
Yes, in that case we can. Also, we have some mechanisms where people can report to us without even ILRO knowing who they are. Like you could report to us by telephone or on our website or by mail without giving us your name or address or any contact information, and we'll still process that complaint and it'll still get investigated. A downside in that case is the complainant, might not find out what happened directly because we won't know how to get back to them.
So if there is I know you talked about how you have limited powers for investigation, and one of those being, officer involved shooting that led in a death. So, but if there's an officer involved shooting, what exactly does your office do in that situation?
Great question. This is a very new power, so it's evolving and it'll probably change in the future. But what we're doing right now is first taking a look at what evidence was gathered in a criminal investigation. So the standard practice in our jurisdiction is that if a deputy is involved in a shooting, the county will commence a criminal investigation of that deputy and anybody else at the scene through some other police agency. A lot of the time that'll be another police agency in Sonoma County, like the Santa Rosa Police Department, for example, which is the largest other agency other than the sheriff's office. Or it could be done by the state attorney general's office, which sometimes investigates shootings of that sort. And then we'll look through the material they gather. They have access to crime labs and forensic investigators that we don't. And so we'll rely on some of that work. But then we'll actually interview the deputies directly ourselves as well. And oftentimes what we're looking for there is not just why did the deputy shoot, but all the other policy considerations that would go into the situation. What were the tactics that the deputy or some of the other deputies might have used at the scene? Were they following policy about not just the shooting, but other uses of force or arrests or detentions they might have made at the scene, and how did that contribute to the scenario? And we try to look not just for whether we think the shooting was or wasn't justified. That's obviously very important, and that's the top priority. But we also look to whether policy or training could have been improved to lead to a better outcome. What else can we learn from the shooting that might be helpful in creating a better outcome next time?
That's really good to hear. I mean, that is the type of, and I'm going to use this term because I just led a training this morning and it came up as an accusation, but I actually think it's a great thing. Monday morning quarterbacking. The necessity of coming in and reviewing every single action and asking, not just how the actions were executed, but asking, did we run the right play? Like, did we train everyone to be able to handle this type of situation? Did we anticipate this type of situation? What are the lessons that could be learned here? Did we do enough to keep officers safe? Did we do enough to keep the community safe? Was this a moment for de-escalation, or was there an appropriate response here? Did our officers have the right equipment to be able to make the decisions they needed to make? Did they have the right access to resources, supervision? were they supported by their supervisors? Were they supported by their fellow officers in the scene? There's a lot of questions that need to be asked, even down to, did everyone involved get medical care that they needed to receive in a timely manner? And then was the scene maintained, the integrity of the investigation, was that all done properly? There's a lot to review and to ask about, and it's good to hear that you're going to be working in collaboration with other law enforcement offices in California to be able to ask those questions.
Yeah, I agree. I think in some law enforcement agencies, there's been a tendency to rally around whoever the shooting officer was. And I can understand to some extent that when you have a coworker who's been through a stressful situation, there's an instinct to support them, right? That said, in many professions, it's really important that when something significant happens, we double check all the work, right? When someone dies in a hospital, there's a great deal of effort that goes into assessing down to the minute detail everything that happened with that patient in the days leading up to, or even the moments leading up to the death, just to see what could be done better or differently next time, even if everyone did exactly what they were trained to do. And I think it's important we do that in law enforcement too.
This is important work, and important work deserves a high level of scrutiny.
Exactly.
So say, and of course, we talk about this with a level of kind of, I would say like precision, but this is a very like personal thing. And for any listener who's listening who might be sensitive to the idea of officer-involved shootings, as one should be, we're talking about this in terms of the profession of having to review these actions to determine if they are following within some type of legality, if they're legal or if they abide by policy. But what would you do if there was an officer-involved shooting like that night? God forbid there was one. What do you do? Are you notified? Are you out there on the scene immediately? Do you go to autopsies?
In our case, we are notified, but we don't go to the scene. And one of the reasons for that is that historically, the way the Sonoma County Sheriff's Office has operated is they try to wait on their administrative or personnel investigation into the deputy until they think the criminal investigation has been gotten to the point where it's either complete or a decision has been made about whether to charge the deputy with a crime. So we follow along in the same shoes as internal affairs and start our investigation at the same time that they do. That's not what everybody else does. I've worked in other jurisdictions where civilian oversight and the administrative or personnel investigation from internal affairs started the same night as the criminal investigation, and they had very careful bumpers to make sure that nothing that the administrative investigation did might compromise the criminal investigation. But not all jurisdictions are able to pull that off. And I think right now in Sonoma County, we're not there yet.
So here in New Orleans, if there's an officer-involved shooting, we're notified immediately, and we do go out to the scene, but we're not there in an investigatory capacity. We're there to monitor. So we effectively follow behind the force investigation team and follow every single step of their investigation. We ensure that officers are sequestered. We ensure that the scene is secured. Mm-hmm. We watch all of the witness interviews, the evidence collection, the clearing of weapons. And we also watch to see how they engage with the community behind the police tape and the community that might be affected by that shooting. So on that note, how do you engage with your community after there's a shooting like an officer-involved shooting, which we understand can be extraordinarily disruptive to the police department, to the community, mostly to the community, truthfully. So how do you engage with them? How do you engage with do you talk to, say, the family of the individual who might have been shot? Yeah,
we have offered to talk to families of individuals who have been shot, at least since I've been at ILRO. Folks don't always take us up on that, and I think there are a number of reasons why, which is understandable, but I always like to make the offer. We also are willing to talk to them sometime after. If they want to come talk to us months or even years later, we're happy to still talk. We also have, this is one way our Community Advisory Council, I think, really kicks in. All the members of that council are appointed from different parts of the county and all have connections with different parts of the community. Geographically, it's a pretty good-sized county, So depending on where the shooting happens, you might have a very different community involved, right? And so we reach out to people that we already know in that community to find out if the community would like to talk to us some more. How are people feeling about that shoot? Some really do require having some community conversation, and we encourage the sheriff's office to also talk to community where they're willing to. Other shootings have been vastly less controversial. You know, just as a comparison point, we had one that happened a little bit before I came to the office that created tremendous community tension, and we have spent a lot of time talking to community about that particular shooting. We had another one a year later that was really unfortunate, but I think the details of that shooting were ones that did not particularly upset the community. There was a man who manufactured a weapon and then was hiding in one of the smaller towns in Sonoma County and taking shots at deputies whenever he had the opportunity. And I think, you know, after he survived, but after he was shot, I think there was very little community concern about how that was handled. And the sheriff's office, to its credit, did a very good job of explaining what happened, how it happened, making body-worn camera footage available immediately. And I think community felt pretty satisfied by the response on that one. So it varies a lot from case to case.
I imagine it does, but I will underscore that in that example, it was extremely transparent. There was some immediacy to the understanding that the community wanted to know what happened, wanted to understand why the law enforcement office had made the decisions that they made. And then there was an ability for the community to be able to see the footage and to be able to engage directly with the department to get information that they needed to be able to be, in some ways, assured that this was a legal or necessary action.
Yeah, I think that kind of transparency is really key. And the approach to the affected community is important too. So in Sonoma County, we have a population that's, depending on whose numbers you look at, anywhere from 1/3 to 40% Latino. And within that population, approximately half are monolingual Spanish speakers. And even then, there's a small number who speak Spanish as a second language, and their first language is an indigenous language from Mexico or Central America. And so language access issues in the context of shootings are really quite sensitive in Sonoma County. So when we have shootings that involve Spanish-speaking individuals, there's a lot of concern in community about feeling targeted or perhaps not being understood, and certainly a lot of concern about how that person was communicated with and in what language as the incident was unfolding. And those cases really require a lot of community outreach, I think, because there's such a frayed relationship between the Spanish-speaking community in the county and the sheriff's office.
Wow, that point really, again, use the term underscores, but it really highlights the need to understand the community you're working in prior to starting this work, because you do have to know how these different neighborhoods or sub-communities are going to interact with one another, what identities they might share, and what their historical experience has been, and therefore what their collective memories and shared traumas might be. And because that shapes the fears or the feelings that they might enter into an encounter with the law enforcement carrying. So it's great that you're able to identify those things in Sonoma, but you're not from Sonoma, right?
No, I grew up in Ohio and had a lot of family in California. Moved to Northern California when I was 18 and have stayed since then. But and I've worked in Sonoma County before, but this is the first time I've lived in Sonoma County.
Well, often Stella and I have a conversation about, you know, the differences for being an insider or an outsider. You know, do you have an advantage if you're from that city that you're monitoring? Do you have a disadvantage if you're not from that city that you're monitoring? So you being from Cincinnati and monitoring in Sonoma, how do you feel about that?
That's a great question. I think it helps that I've lived at least in the Bay Area for a long time and that I've worked in Sonoma County a couple times before. So I came into the job with at least some understanding of the community. But I think anytime one is an oversight, you know, even if you have lived in the community that you're now providing oversight for, you might be surprised how much you don't know about your own town.
Yes.
And I think it's really essential to have an open mind and to also affirmatively reach out to people. And in any community where there's been oversight for a while, there's usually some history about which parts of the community were most invested in creating the oversight, and making sure you're staying in touch with those stakeholders who really cared in the first place, I think is essential. I used to do police oversight in San Francisco, and that oversight system was created primarily by a coalition from the black community and the gay community, both of whom in the 70s felt really mistreated by the police department. And so in the early 80s, they created this oversight system, and staying in touch with those stakeholders, even now, 40 years later, is still really important in that system, because those are the key people that are often the most concerned. Over time, that changes. You know, there are other populations now in San Francisco that are really concerned about police oversight, particularly homeless people. And that's a real change from 40 years ago. But, you know, so it's a little bit of both, you know, knowing the history, but also staying attuned to the community, getting out there and talking to people, making sure people feel comfortable coming to you, doing things like this radio program that you guys do and all the social media presence you have.
So what I'm hearing is you have to be open to actually get to know the people that you're working with.
Yeah, absolutely.
So do you think, though, John, that there are any benefits from being an outsider?
I loved, by the way, that you're the one asking that question, Chriselle, because Chriselle, a proud
Yes.
McDonough 35 graduate,
Yes.
proud Ron Eagle, right?
Right, from New Orleans, born
Yes.
and raised.
Asking if there's an advantage to not being from the place you're monitoring.
I think sometimes, you know, like a fish in water, we don't always see the patterns that are around us all the time. And we might not always be aware of ways to do things differently, right? So when I come into a new community from the outside, at least I can say, hey, you know, I've been in oversight for a while now, and I've seen how things are done in some communities. Every community is different and has unique needs. But here are some tools I've seen that worked in some other places, and would these work for you? So sometimes I'm able to offer new tools or new perspectives that might break a log jam or help a problem that's gotten stagnated locally. But I really do rely on local people to help me understand the local culture, the local needs, the history. So it's really great to form alliances or coalitions with people who have been in the community a long time if I'm from outside.
That's great advice. That's great advice. And so let's just throw this out there. If there is anyone listening who would like to go into this field and they know that there's only maybe so many monitors in one place that can exist, so that means they might have to pack their bags and move somewhere else, do you have any advice to them on how to do that effectively?
Oh. Well, I think one would be think about what you can offer to a new community when you're coming in. So when people ask you that question, well, you're not from here, how are you going to be able to help us with this problem? Figure out what the tools or perspectives or insights you have are that might be useful to them. And also when you get to the new place, really immerse yourself in it, right? Like, don't spend a lot of time going back to where we were before. Pardon me. Spend your time hanging out in that community, living in that community, getting to know what it's like to be there day to day. Like, don't let yourself be a visitor. Like, really start getting to know the place. And do whatever it is that you would do in your personal time off, too, to get to know the place a little bit better. Because I can't tell you how many times I've been out in community just, on a Sunday afternoon and some time off and learned something really useful about Sonoma County just from chatting with people I might meet at a restaurant or, going to some public event I think is fun for me, but maybe isn't, related to oversight. It's really helpful.
I want to joke that, like, you get to a new place, immediately run a red light. Just see firsthand what it's like to get pulled over by your law enforcement agency, so that way you could be secret shopper, like a secret customer, and just check it out.
Well, I have a story I can share with you about that.
Yeah,
so
I would love to
I know
hear.
someone who's been a police chief in a number of places, not Ann Kirkpatrick, somebody else. And they were telling me, when I go to a new city, before anyone knows who I am or that I'm an applicant, I'll just sort of travel around town a little bit and see if I run into some police officers and chat with them. And so he told a story about how, he came across this police officer at a place he was thinking about working. He was sitting on a motorcycle in a shady spot and was presumably supposed to be doing some traffic enforcement. So he just started chatting with him. And this officer explained how great the motorcycle detail was because nobody really supervised him. He didn't really have to do any work, and it was the greatest gig ever, and he was pretty close to retirement, and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Not the things you really want to tell your incoming police chief. And that gave him a lot of insight about how that unit worked.
Oh, that's good. That's good. Especially, to say that to your future chief. I love that. So you brought up Chief Kirkpatrick. So let's roll with that. You worked in Oakland for the Oakland Community Police Review Agency, right?
Right.
And I have a handful of questions about your time as the monitor in that city. And I know you started that work in July 2019. But let's not bury the lead. Who was the police chief while you were monitoring Oakland Police Department?
Ann Kirkpatrick.
Ann Kirkpatrick. What was it like monitoring the Oakland Police Department under Chief Kirkpatrick?
I really enjoyed working with her. And one of the things I enjoyed was that we had very frequent meetings about discipline cases. So the system in Oakland was such that my agency, CPRA, would do a parallel administrative investigation to the one done by Internal Affairs. And then we'd have a meeting, usually on Friday mornings, with Chief Kirkpatrick and the rest of her command staff and the Internal Affairs Division staff and my staff to discuss what each of our positions were on each case. Because if we disagreed about how to resolve the case, that disagreement would be forwarded to our Civilian Police Commission for resolution, and they would get to make the final call. So we would sit down together in a conference room, watch key segments of body-worn camera footage, discuss key policies that applied to each case, and determine what allegations were going to be sustained, and if officers were going to be disciplined, what the level of discipline was going to be. So it was a really robust conversation on a weekly basis, and doing that work with her, I got to understand her thought process about discipline. And one thing I've heard her say a number of times, I think you've heard her say this here in New Orleans, is when you mess up, fess up. And I think that's a great short summary of an attitude both she and I share about the best way to handle police misconduct. If an officer has done something wrong, that error might be anything from a simple accidental mistake to evidence that that officer really has the wrong attitude and the wrong judgment to be a police officer anymore. And there's a whole lot of shades of gray in between. And one key issue there is, well, does the officer recognize what they did wrong, and are they willing to fess up when they mess up? That's a huge positive if they are. And that was one of the key things that she and I both looked for in those cases. And it turned out that she and I didn't always agree with the rest of her command staff, but she and I often agreed. And I think part of the reason for that was we had a very similar philosophy about police discipline.
Okay. And were you there when Chief Kirkpatrick was fired?
I was.
What was that like?
I was disappointed in that outcome because I thought she was doing a good job as chief. I also think she was in a tough position strategically in that she had been appointed by the mayor at a time in which Oakland allowed the mayor to directly appoint the police chief. And while she was in office as the police chief, there was a voter-approved initiative that changed that process, such that the police commission had to pick a short list of police chiefs and give that to the mayor, and the mayor had to pick from that very short list. So to put it another way, there was suddenly a new, very important stakeholder in town, a police commission, who had not picked Ann Kirkpatrick. Somebody else had already picked her previously. And I think that they had a hard time finding a way to work together, which was unfortunate because I think she did a great job in Oakland, and I think that was ultimately to Oakland's detriment that she wasn't there longer.
That is such an important point. How we pick leaders matters. And if you're not including the right stakeholders in the room, or if the stakeholders in that decision change, it's going to influence ultimately your pick.
Right, and I think you see that in a lot of cities when, say, the mayor changes. In many cities, the mayor directly picks the police chief, And you get a new mayor, you get a new chief.
Right.
That's not uncommon at all. I think people find that pretty normal and understandable. I also think it's well known at this point that a challenge that Ann Kirkpatrick had was that several members of the commission did some things that were objectively inappropriate, using their status to get out of getting in trouble themselves, trying to access documents that they couldn't legally access. And she was willing to obey the law in those instances and also report people when they did things that were inappropriate. And I think that particular set of commissioners had a hard time accepting that they themselves were not actually complying with the law at that time, and that they were being held
out
accountable.
for it.
Yeah, that's right. And that's a tough situation for anyone to be in when someone who is one of your bosses is doing something inappropriate. That's a hard place to be.
It's a very hard.
And considering that Chief Kirkpatrick is our chief of police here now, do you have any advice for the community here about working with Chief Kirkpatrick?
In my experience, she is someone who really wants to know how community feels and what community thinks about her performance. And so I would say if you either have a positive or negative feedback, I'd reach out to her. I think you'll find her responsive, and she'll take whatever those concerns are to heart. I also think she's a good communicator. So if she has a response for you about the feedback you're giving, it's sincere, and she really wants to be in dialogue with you. So take advantage of that too. Follow up on the conversation that she starts.
And do you have any lessons that you learned from that time?
Well, intriguingly, I ended up having a similar problem to Ann Kirkpatrick in that a couple of years later, we had a slightly different commission. Well, I should say a significantly different commission. Most of the members of the commission who originally had hired me had left, and I had a commission that was quite different. And several of them asked me if I would start setting a quota or a level of number of officers that I would sustain for misconduct at any given period of time. Basically, I was told if I wasn't sustaining a certain number of officers for misconduct in a certain period of time, that wasn't going to work for the police commission.
And sorry, just
Interesting.
real fast. What does sustain mean for anyone who's listening?
Sustained means conclude that the officer violated policy.
Okay, so they were basically saying you need to conclude that an officer was violating policy 20 times in a month.
They never gave me a specific number, but I got the feedback that it had to be higher, and the existing numbers were not high enough, and therefore they just needed to be a higher number regardless of why.
Regardless of why. Okay. And after you were given that type of information, what happened to your employment?
It ended pretty quickly. That was a course of maybe about 2 months between the time those conversations started and the time I was out. And I think that it only took 2 months because that's how long it took for them to actually do all the paperwork to get me out of there, which was regrettable. And, I spent some time during that window trying to point out the ways in which the work that we were doing was of very high quality. For example, there had been some protests in 2020 in Oakland, as there were in many cities. And in 2021, we had sustained a lot of officers for violating use of force policy and crowd control policy in the course of responding to those protests. And that was some really robust work that we did. And so I also thought there was a good narrative that the police commission could have about how their work in changing the use of force policy in Oakland and their work in making sure the training in Oakland matched the policy had really caused an improvement in officer use of force. It was less common, it was less severe, the number of officer-involved shootings had gone down, and for that reason, also you might expect that the number of sustained findings for use of force, meaning finding that officers had violated use of force policy, might go down because they're actually doing a better job of complying with community expectation. But I think that narrative wasn't one that that particular commission wanted to adopt.
So what were your lessons learned from this experience of effectively being terminated because you were abiding by the policy, you were following the law, you were doing what you believed you needed to do, but that clashed with the desire of what this community and commission wanted from this position? What was that like for you?
Well, it was disappointing because I think anytime community gets more involved in policing, there's probably going to be a period in which there's going to be some conflict with the police department. But ultimately, what you hope for is that the police and community will come closer together and that there'll be a higher level of community satisfaction with the police, right? And I think for at least a period of time, that was what we were seeing in Oakland, particularly before the pandemic and during the time that Ann Kirkpatrick was there. And so for people who are in community or in oversight, I think we need to be open to the idea that things might have actually improved. That is ultimately our goal, right? And if someone is on a police commission or in community and they feel that their job is to always critique and never praise, then that creates a dynamic in which even when you're successful, you're not going to be able to admit to the community you're successful because you've created an expectation that your only job is to critique.
You've created an expectation that for you, being successful is effectively always cracking down, always bringing down a hammer.
Always saying that the police department failed.
Yeah,
Right.
always saying they failed.
Right.
That effectively a good monitor is a monitor that is always saying you did something wrong.
Right. And in my experience, there are sometimes police departments where a lot of things are going wrong all at the same time, and there's a lot of critique to provide. But I have also seen some police departments who make improvements, start meeting community expectation a little bit better. And where that happens, even if it's just in one part of the police department's performance, I think it's important to call that out too. I think police oversight is most effective when it's neutral. I'm not great at sports metaphors, but a lot of people say call balls and strikes, right? And try to do it fairly. And I think that actually ends up being a more effective way to create change. If a police department knows that the monitor is willing to say, hey, this program changed over the last year and we see significant improvement, the department deserves some praise for that. But this other program didn't improve and actually got worse. I think that contrast really helps police departments understand that there is a way to have positive relationship with a monitor and community by actually being responsive to the recommendations that we make.
Well, that is great advice for anyone who's listening who wants to go into a police oversight role. And so for my final question, it's really more of a request. I would love to hear your elevator pitch as to why an organization like the National Association for Civilian Oversight over Law Enforcement is so helpful to communities and to practitioners in this field, and even law enforcement that's considering how to be more oversight-minded.
Well, I'd say one part of the pitch is for a lot of folks in oversight's relatively new, or alternatively has been a process in which there hasn't been great connection between community and police over the course of the creation of oversight. That's a pattern that's happened in a lot of places. Some communities have found ways to improve that dynamic, and you can meet those people at NACOL and learn from them. It may be the case that oversight is pretty new in a lot of places, but there's so many places doing it that you can learn from each other, and NACOL's the main place you can do that in this country. So I think that's really useful. I have found the lessons I've learned from other people at NACOL to be really helpful in my own work, and it's definitely improved my ability to create relationship with community, create relationship with police agencies, and also to make more thoughtful, more creative policy recommendations.
Well, thank you for letting us know that, and congratulations to being elected onto the NACOL board. And we also want to congratulate from afar Bansil Shokunbi, our former comrade, our former deputy police monitor, who's now the police monitor of Fort Worth, who also was elected at the same conference to now become on the board of the National Association for Civilian Oversight over Law Enforcement. So that's great.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to working with her.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
And that wraps up today's episode of The Monitor's Mic. I want to extend a heartfelt thank you to all our listeners for tuning in and staying engaged with the crucial conversations we're having about police oversight and community safety. A special thank you to John Alden for the time and invaluable insights he shared, making today's show possible. If you missed any part of today's show or want to catch up on past episodes, visit our website, www.nolaipm.gov. You can find and follow us on YouTube at NOLA IPM, You can also follow us on social media for updates and news on Instagram at NOLA OIPM and Facebook at New Orleans Independent Police Monitor.
And sorry, just before you do your final close off, I just want to do one plug that I almost forgot. On Monday, we're going to be speaking at the New Orleans United Front Forum, which is at Cafe Istanbul at 6 p.m. On St. Claude, like in the Healing Center.
In the Healing Center, yes.
And I believe we're going to be talking about different issues facing sex crimes and DV investigations. And we really want to hear people's feedback. So please, we hope you can attend.
Yes, so make sure y'all come out to Cafe Istanbul. We'll see you at 6 p.m. on Monday. But until next time, stay informed, stay involved, and stay committed to building a safer community. This has been the Monitor's Mic.